The wrench slipped from Megan Lawson's oil-stained fingers as the hangar door rattled against another brutal Alaskan gust. At 30, she'd spent more time elbow-deep in aircraft engines than most pilots logged in cockpits. But here, at Elmendorf Air Force Base, she was just the mechanic and necessary tool that happened to breathe and collect a paycheck. "Weather's looking nasty out there," she muttered to herself, wiping her hands on the worn rag that never left her tool belt. Through the hangar's frosted windows, she could see snow already beginning to fall in thick, determined flakes. Her trained eye read the sky like a book written in her father's crop-dusting business 20 years ago, when she'd learned to fly before her feet could properly reach the pedals. Captain Rodriguez strode into the briefing room with his usual swagger, his voice carrying that particular brand of authority that came with rank rather than respect. "All right, people, listen up. We've got a supply run to an outpost that's running dangerously low on medical supplies. Weather's deteriorating fast, but Command wants this done before the storm hits full force." Megan lingered near the back of the room, invisible as always. She'd learned long ago that speaking up only earned her patronizing smiles and reminders about staying in her lane. But her stomach twisted as she studied the weather reports spread across the briefing table. The storm system was moving faster than predicted, and those temperature gradients looked murderous. Lieutenant Barnes, fresh-faced from flight school, nudged his co-pilot with a cocky grin. "At least we've got our trusty wrench turner back there if something breaks, right, Lawson?" The joke earned scattered chuckles from the crew, but Megan said nothing. She never did. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask, was that she'd grown up breathing aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid. Her father's small crop dusting operation had been her playground, her classroom, her entire world until budget cuts and corporate farming forced them to close. She'd traded pilot dreams for steady military employment, but the sky still called to her in ways these career officers would never understand. "Lawson," Sergeant Mills called out, his tone carrying that familiar edge of dismissal. "Make sure those engines keep purring for us. We don't want to end up walking home through bear country." His laugh was sharp, cutting through the briefing room like a blade. "Roger that," she replied quietly, shouldering her equipment pack. The other crew members were already discussing flight paths and fuel calculations, their voices overlapping with professional confidence. They planned their route like it was just another milk run, but Megan could feel something ominous building. In the atmospheric pressure, a heaviness that spoke of violence waiting in the clouds. After the briefing, she conducted her own inspection of the C-130 Hercules, running her hands along every panel, checking every connection with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details meant the difference between life and death. The aircraft was older than she was, but beautifully maintained, a testament to the crews who'd cared for it over the decades. Still, the weather reports nagged at her like a persistent headache. Severe turbulence, icing conditions, visibility, near zero conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. She watched Captain Rodriguez swagger toward the aircraft, his confidence unshaken by the darkening sky, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan wind. As the crew strapped themselves into their positions, pilots up front, navigator, and loadmaster at their stations, Megan found herself alone in the cargo bay with her monitoring equipment. Through the small porthole, Alaska's wilderness stretched endlessly below, beautiful and utterly unforgiving. She'd seen what this country could do to people who underestimated it, how quickly it could turn from breathtaking to deadly. 30 minutes to drop zone. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom. "Weather's holding for now." But Megan could feel it in the aircraft's subtle tremors, in the slight irregularity of Engine 2's rhythm that only her trained ear could detect. The storm was coming faster than predicted, and storms in Alaska didn't ask permission. They took what they wanted when they wanted it. She pressed her palm against the cargo bay wall, feeling the vibrations of 4 massive engines working in harmony. For now. But something whispered in her gut, a pilot's intuition that had never failed her father and had kept her alive through countless dangerous flights in her younger days. Tonight was going to test everyone aboard this aircraft, in ways they couldn't imagine. The crew had no idea that their wrench-turner had once threaded her way through mountain passes in weather that would ground commercial flights, or that she could read an engine's mood like poetry. They saw only what they expected to see. A mechanic, useful but unremarkable. Someone to fix things when they broke, but never someone to trust with their lives. That perception was about to change in the most dramatic way possible. The first sign of trouble came as a whisper, a subtle irregularity in Engine 2's rhythm that made Megan frown at her monitoring panel. The temperature gauge fluctuated, just outside normal parameters, nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but definitely wrong to someone who'd spent her life listening to engines breathe. She keyed her headset. Control, this is maintenance. I'm seeing some anomalous readings on Engine 2. Temperature's running a bit hot, and the rhythm sounds off. Captain Rodriguez's voice came back clipped and dismissive. Readings are normal. Up here, Lawson. Everything's green on our end. Sir, I'm telling you something's not right. I can hear it in the... Lawson, we appreciate your attention to detail, but let the pilots handle the flying, okay? Your job is to monitor, not diagnose. The radio clicked off with finality that left no room for argument. Megan bit back her response, her jaw clenching with familiar frustration. She'd been through this dance 100 times before, the polite dismissal, the gentle reminder of her place in the hierarchy, the assumption that rank trumped experience every single time. But the engine's irregular beat continued to pulse through the aircraft's frame like a stuttering heartbeat. 20 minutes later, the storm hit them like nature's own freight train. The C-130 bucked and rolled as wind slammed into them from every direction with the fury of something alive and malevolent. Snow struck the windows like bullets, reducing visibility to absolute zero. Megan braced herself against the cargo webbing as the aircraft pitched violently, her stomach lurching with each sudden drop. Control, this is Hercules 77. Captain Rodriguez's voice carried new tension, the professional calm beginning to crack around the edges. We're encountering severe turbulence and icing conditions. Requesting vector to alternate landing site. The radio dissolved into static, pure, empty static that sounded like the voice of the void itself. Engine 2's warning light flickered red, then steady. Within seconds, Engine 3 joined it, warning lights blinking like Christmas decorations. From hell? The aircraft shuddered around them, each vibration carrying the promise of catastrophic failure. Jesus Christ! Lieutenant Barnes's voice cracked through the intercom, all pretense of military composure gone. We're losing power on 2 and 3, sir. The gauges are going crazy up here. Megan was already moving, her hands flying over the engine monitoring controls with practiced precision. Ice was building faster than the desing systems could handle. She could see it accumulating on the wing surfaces through the cargo bay's small window like armor plating. Too much, too fast. The engines were starving for clean air, choking on frozen moisture that clogged every intake. Captain, she called into her headset, I need to manually adjust the fuel mixture. The ice is disrupting the negative, Lawson. Return to your station and monitor only. We've got this under control. But they clearly didn't have it under control. The aircraft dropped another 500 feet, then 1,000. The engines running rough and fighting against ice that coated every surface like a death shroud. Through her headset, she could hear the panic creeping into Rodriguez's voice, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Engine 4's warning light joined the others, and the C-130 shuddered like a wounded animal. They were losing altitude steadily now, the engines struggling against conditions that were quickly becoming unsurvivable. The storm raged around them with primordial fury, indifferent to the fragile human lives caught in its grip. "We're not gonna make it," Barnes whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar. That's when Megan made a decision that would change everything. She unbuckled from her station and stood up, moving forward through the violently swaying cargo bay with the steady balance of someone who'd worked in cramped engine compartments during turbulence her entire life. Years of maintenance work in impossible conditions had taught her a grace that no flight school could provide. "Lawson, get back to your station," Sergeant Mills shouted, his face pale with terror. But Megan was already at the cockpit door, watching. Captain Rodriguez struggled with controls that were becoming increasingly unresponsive. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the freezing air seeping through every seal. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Let me help." "Help with what?" "Get back to the engines." She interrupted something she'd never done before in all her years of service. "I know these birds better than anyone. I can get you power back." Lieutenant Barnes looked at her with undisguised skepticism, his young face twisted with disbelief. "No offense, but this isn't a maintenance issue. This is flying, and you're not a pilot." Engine 4's warning light joined the others. The C-130 shuddered again, and they dropped another 100 feet. Through the windscreen, nothing but white no. Horizon, no reference points. Just the howling void of the Alaskan storm, ready to swallow them whole. "We're going down," Barnes whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's rage. But Megan had already made her choice. She'd spent too many years in the background, watching and waiting while others made decisions that affected everyone's safety. Tonight, silence wasn't an option anymore. "We're going down," Barnes whispered again, his hand shaking on the controls, as another violent downdraft slammed into the aircraft. The C-130 dropped like a stone, instruments spinning wildly as Captain Rodriguez fought to maintain any semblance of control. Megan watched the scene unfold with growing horror and determination. 20 years of military training couldn't hide the panic in Rodriguez's eyes as he stared at instruments that were rapidly becoming useless. His knuckles were white on the yoke, sweat streaming down his face despite the frigid air. "Captain," she said again, stepping fully into the cockpit, "I've flown these conditions before. You've flown?" Rodriguez stared at her in complete disbelief, his eyes wide, with shock and desperation. "What do you mean you've flown?" "My whole life," she replied simply, already reaching for the engine controls with movements born from decades of intimate knowledge. "But right now, talking isn't going to save us. Moving is." The aircraft dropped again, and everyone felt their stomachs lurch violently. Outside, the storm raged with primal fury, indifferent to the human lives caught helplessly in its grip. Ice continued building on the wings, adding weight they couldn't afford while reducing lift they desperately needed. "But you're not certified," Rodriguez snapped, his training warring with the reality of their situation. "You're not qualified to." "Sir, with all due respect," Megan interrupted, her voice carrying quiet authority that cut through the noise like a blade. "Certification doesn't mean much when we're about to become a crater in the wilderness. I grew up flying crop dusters through mountain passes in weather that would ground commercial flights. These Hercules birds are temperamental, but they're honest. They tell you exactly what they need if you know how to listen." Another alarm began shrieking as Engine 1 started running rough. Barnes looked like he was about to be sick, his face green under the cockpit lights. "4 engines," he whispered. "We're losing all 4 engines." That's when Megan made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Without waiting for permission, she slipped into the co-pilot's position, her hands moving over the controls with surgical precision. Her fingers danced across switches and levers with the confidence of someone who'd lived inside these machines' childhood. "Barnes, give me manual control of the fuel mixture," she commanded, her voice steady despite the aircraft's violent shaking. "But you're not authorized to, Barnes." Her voice carried a snap of authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Either help me save us, or shut up and let me work." The young lieutenant's mouth fell open, but he moved aside. For the first time in her military career, Megan wasn't asking permission or following protocol. She was taking charge, and the urgency in her voice brooked no argument. She'd already identified the problem with the sharp eye of someone who'd diagnosed 1,000 engine failures. Ice crystals were disrupting the fuel flow, causing the engines to run lean and overheat. The automated systems were fighting the problem instead of adapting to it, making everything worse with each electronic correction. "I'm going to manual override on all engines," she announced, her hands already working with fluid grace. "The computer keeps trying to compensate for ice that isn't actually blocking the sensors anymore. It's choking them to death." She pulled back the throttles, feeling the aircraft settle momentarily before adjusting the fuel mixture with the delicate touch of a master surgeon. Engine 2's warning light flickered once, twice, and went out. The change in the engine's tone was immediately audible, smoother, stronger, more confident. "How did you ... Barnes started, his mouth hanging open in amazement. 20 years. Of flying with my dad," Megan replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. "He taught me that every aircraft has a personality, a way it wants to be treated. You have to listen to what it's telling you, not just what the gauges say." Engine 3 responded next, its rhythm smoothing as she fine-tuned the mixture with microscopic adjustments born from years of experience. But even as the engines came back online, the storm wasn't finished with them. A massive downdraft slammed into the aircraft like a giant's fist, dropping them 500 feet in seconds. "We're still losing altitude," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with fear despite the improving engine performance. "Even with the engines running smooth, we don't have enough lift to maintain level flight with all this ice." Megan studied the flight instruments with the intensity of someone reading a familiar book written in a language only she understood. Wind speed, direction, pressure differentials, all the variables her father had taught her to interpret when flying through mountain valleys where margins for error simply didn't exist. "There," she pointed to the navigation display with certainty. "See that pressure gradient? There's a thermal column about 2 miles northwest. If we can reach it, it'll lift us above this mess." "In this storm, we can't see anything," Rodriguez protested. "It's suicide to try navigating by thermals in zero visibility." "I can feel it," she said simply, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "Trust me." Without waiting for approval, she took the control yoke from Rodriguez's hands. Her touch was completely different, lighter, more intuitive, more connected to the aircraft itself. Where he'd been fighting the storm like an enemy, she seemed to be dancing with it like a partner who knew all the steps. The C-130 responded like a different aircraft entirely. Instead of battling the wind, Megan used it, finding pockets of stable air that the instruments couldn't detect, but her experience recognized instinctively. She guided them through the chaos with movements so subtle they barely registered on the controls. "Son of a gun," Mills whispered from behind them, his voice filled with awe. "She's actually doing it. She's flying us out of this nightmare." Engine 4 came back online as Megan's adjustments finally reached it. All 4 power plants now running smooth and strong, despite the continuing storm. The difference was like night and day, where moments before they'd been riding a dying beast towards certain destruction. Now they had a living, breathing aircraft beneath them again. But the real test came when she found her thermal column, that narrow corridor of rising air that would lift them above the worst of the weather. Banking into it required precision that bordered on artistry, especially with zero visibility, and instruments that couldn't show her what she needed to know. "Here we go," she murmured, and eased the aircraft into a gentle climbing turn that felt like floating on air itself. The C-130 caught the thermal like a glider finding an updraft. Suddenly, they were rising, climbing steadily through the storm's fury toward clearer air above. The violent shaking smoothed out, replaced by the steady climb of an aircraft that had found its element again. "I don't believe it," Barnes breathed, watching the altimeter spin upward as they broke through the cloud layer into brilliant, clear air above the storm. Sunlight flooded the cockpit for the first time in what felt like hours, warm and golden and impossible. The crew sat in stunned silence, watching the white carpet of clouds spread endlessly below them like a peaceful ocean. They were alive. They were flying. And the woman they dismissed as just a mechanic had saved them all with skills they never knew existed. "Emergency airfield is 20 minutes ahead," Megan said quietly, already plotting their approach with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "We'll make it easy." Captain Rodriguez found his voice first, thick with emotion and newfound respect. "Lawson, I owe you an apology. How? We all do." But Megan was already unbuckling her harness, preparing to return to her usual place in the background where invisible people did invisible work. "Just doing my job, sir." "No," Lieutenant Barnes said firmly, his entire attitude transformed by what he'd witnessed. "What you did up there wasn't just a job. That was pure artistry. The landing was absolutely perfect." Megan set the C-130 down on the emergency airstrip with the gentle touch of someone who understood that aircraft have souls. The main gear kissed the runway without so much as a bounce, and the crew released breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. As the engine spun down, silence filled the cockpit, not the terrifying quiet of imminent death, but the peaceful hush of survival earned through skill and courage. For the first time in her military career, Megan felt the weight of command, the responsibility that came with making life and death decisions for others. Over the following days, word of the incident spread through the base with lightning speed. But this wasn't the usual hangar gossip. This was different, respectful, tinged with the kind of awe reserved for genuine heroes. Captain Rodriguez submitted a formal recommendation that Megan be transferred to active flight duty, recognizing that her mechanical expertise, combined with flying skills, made her invaluable in ways the military was only beginning to understand. The younger officers who'd once joked about the wrench turner now sought her out for advice. They wanted to understand how she'd read the storm, how she'd coax life from dying engines, how she'd found clear air in the midst of chaos. Megan found herself in the unfamiliar position of being listened to, her opinions valued rather than dismissed. Sergeant Mills, who'd been one of her harshest critics, became one of her strongest advocates. "I've flown with a lot of pilots," he told anyone who'd listen, "but I've never seen someone make a Hercules dance like that." But perhaps the most meaningful change came from Captain Rodriguez himself. A week after the incident, he approached Megan in the hangar where she was working on routine maintenance. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by genuine humility. "Lawson," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about what happened up there, about how close we came to ... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I wanted you to know that I've learned something important about assumptions, about recognizing real experience when I see it." Megan looked up from her work, seeing something different in his eyes. Respect earned through demonstration rather than demanded through rank. "I'll make assumptions, sir. The important thing is being willing to change them when the situation requires it." He nodded slowly. "The transfer paperwork went through this morning. You're being reassigned to active flight status, effective immediately." Command wants pilots who can handle extreme weather conditions, and after what you pulled off." He shook his head in amazement. "Well, let's just say there aren't many who could have brought us home that night." As Rodriguez walked away, Megan felt a profound shift in her world. For the first time in years, she wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was a pilot again, officially recognized for skills she'd never stopped honing, even when others couldn't see them. The official ceremony took place 3 weeks later in the base commander's office, a far cry from the dramatic cockpit where Megan had proven herself. Colonel Patricia Hayes, base commander, personally pinned the wings on Megan's uniform, while photographers documented the moment for both official records and the base newsletter. "Staff Sergeant Lawson," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional change, "your actions that night exemplify the best of what our service members can achieve when experience meets courage. You've earned not just these wings, but the respect of everyone who serves alongside you." The ceremony was small but meaningful. Captain Rodriguez stood at attention nearby, his face showing none of the condescension that had once defined their interactions. Lieutenant Barnes, now sporting a genuine smile rather than a cocky smirk, applauded with enthusiasm. Even Sergeant Mills, never one for emotional displays, wiped at his eyes when he thought no one was looking. But recognition brought its own set of challenges. Megan's first official mission as a pilot came just 2 days after the ceremony, a routine supply run that felt anything but routine given the scrutiny she now faced. Word of her dramatic rescue had spread beyond Elmendorf, attracting attention from military aviation circles across the country. "No pressure," joked Captain Martinez, her new co-pilot, as they conducted pre-flight checks. "Just half the base watching to see if lightning strikes twice." Megan smiled, her hands moving through the familiar ritual of aircraft inspection with practiced ease. "Lightning's got nothing to do with it," she replied. "This is just flying, and flying's just listening to what the aircraft tells you." The mission went flawlessly, but Megan could feel the weight of expectations from everyone around her. She was no longer invisible, no longer the background figure who could work unnoticed. Every decision she made was analyzed, every technique studied by younger pilots, eager to learn from someone who'd proven herself under the most extreme circumstances. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. For years, Megan had carried the quiet ache of deferred dreams, the knowledge that she could do more than her role allowed. Now, thrust suddenly into the spotlight, she had to reconcile the pilot she'd always been with the recognition she'd never expected. Her old hangar became a sort of informal classroom where junior officers would gather during off hours, hoping to absorb some of her hard-won wisdom. At first, the attention made her uncomfortable. She'd spent so long in the background that being the center of focus felt unnatural. "Tell us about reading thermals in a storm," Lieutenant Cooper asked during one of these impromptu sessions. "How do you feel something the instruments can't detect?" Megan thought carefully before answering. "It's not mystical," she said finally. "It's pattern recognition built over thousands of hours. Your body learns to interpret tiny changes in engine sound, slight variations in control pressure, the way the aircraft wants to move. Most people dismiss these inputs as irrelevant, but they're actually the aircraft's way of communicating." She demonstrated by having Cooper sit in the cockpit of a training aircraft while she adjusted various controls microscopically. "Feel that?" she asked as she made a minute change to the trim tab. The yoke pressure just shifted slightly. In severe weather, changes like that tell you about air currents long before they show up on instruments. Word of these informal training sessions reached Colonel Hayes, who saw an opportunity to formalize Megan's teaching role. Within a month, she found herself assigned to the base's advanced weather flying program, charged with developing new protocols for extreme condition operations. "You've given us something we didn't know we were missing," the colonel explained during their meeting. Technical knowledge combined with intuitive flying skills. We want to bottle that expertise and share it with pilots across the service. The assignment represented everything Megan had never dared hope for, not just recognition, but the chance to make a real difference in how the military approached dangerous flying conditions. Yet, it also meant leaving behind the mechanical work that had defined her for so long. Her last day in the maintenance hangar was bittersweet. The crew gathered around as she packed up her tools, these implements that had been extensions of her hands for over a decade. Airman Jackson, barely 18 and new to the service, watched with obvious emotion. "Sergeant Lawson," he said quietly, "you showed me that understanding how something works is just as important as being certified to operate it. I won't forget that." As Megan loaded her toolbox into her truck for the final time, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 3 months ago, she'd been invisible, overlooked, relegated to the background of other people's adventures. Now she was developing training programs that would influence how pilots approached dangerous weather for years to come. The irony wasn't lost on her. It had taken a life-threatening emergency to reveal skills she'd possessed all along. But perhaps that was the nature of expertise. It often remained hidden until circumstances demanded its emergence. The key was being ready when that moment arrived, having maintained abilities that others couldn't see or value. Her new office overlooked the flight line where aircraft took off and landed in an endless cycle of missions. From her window, she could see mechanics working on engines, their hands moving with the same precision and care she'd once brought to the task. They were the invisible experts now, the ones whose skills would emerge when circumstances demanded. 6 months later, Megan stood before a classroom filled with pilots from bases across Alaska, delivering a presentation on extreme weather flying techniques. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. The mechanic who'd once been ignored was now teaching seasoned aviators how to save their own lives. "The most dangerous assumption you can make," she told the assembled officers, "is that your instruments are showing you everything you need to know. In severe weather, your aircraft is constantly communicating through vibrations, sounds, and control responses that aren't quantified by gauges. Learning to interpret these signals can mean the difference between completing your mission and becoming statistic." Major Williams, a 20-year veteran from Fairbanks, raised his hand. "Sergeant Lawson, with respect, how do we know when to trust these intuitive readings over our instrumentation? Our training emphasizes following established procedures." It was a fair question, one that got to the heart of the tension between institutional protocol and individual expertise. Megan had spent months developing her answer, refining it through countless similar discussions. "You don't abandon procedures," she replied, "but you augment them with awareness that extends beyond your instrument panel. Let me show you what I mean." She moved to the flight simulator at the front of the classroom, a sophisticated device that could replicate the exact conditions she'd faced during that stormy night. As the simulation began, she narrated her decision-making process, explaining how subtle changes in engine noise had alerted her to problems before any warning lights appeared. "Listen," she said, adjusting the fuel mixture slightly. "Hear how engine 2's pitch just changed. That's not random variation. That's the engine telling you it's working harder than it should. If you wait for the warning light, you've already lost precious time." The assembled pilots leaned forward, many of them experiencing a fundamental shift in how they thought about flying. These were experienced aviators, but Megan was teaching them to perceive their aircraft as living entities rather than mechanical systems. After the session, Colonel Hayes approached with news that would once again transform Megan's role. "The Pentagon's been following your work here," she said. "They want to expand your training program nationwide. You'd be developing curriculum for the Air Force's new Extreme Weather Operations School. The promotion came with a transfer to Colorado Springs and a significant increase in responsibility. Megan would be working with engineers, meteorologists, and test pilots to create the definitive training program for hazardous weather flying. It was an opportunity that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. But success brought unexpected challenges. As her reputation grew, she found herself increasingly removed from the hands-on flying that had always defined her identity. Administrative duties consumed more of her time, and the comfortable anonymity she'd once known was permanently gone. The transition became even more complex when she was assigned her first direct reports, junior officers who would help develop and implement the new training protocols. Leading from the background was one thing. Managing other people's careers was entirely different. Lieutenant Davis, fresh from the academy, was assigned as her primary research assistant. During their first meeting, his nervous energy filled the small conference room as he shuffled through carefully prepared notes. "Sergeant Lawson, I've studied every report from your rescue mission. I've analyzed the meteorological conditions, the aircraft's performance parameters, even the fuel consumption rates. I was hoping you could help me understand the decision matrix you use for—" "Stop," Megan interrupted gently. "You're trying to turn instinct into an algorithm, and that's not how this works. Come with me." She led into the flight line where a C-130 was undergoing routine maintenance. "Tell me what you see," she said. Davis looked confused. Maintenance crew performing standard inspection procedures according to technical order specifications. "Look deeper. Watch how Airman Peterson adjusts that panel. See how she's not just following the checklist, she's feeling for vibrations, listening for unusual sounds, checking things that aren't in any manual because her experience tells her they matter." As they observed the maintenance crew, Megan explained how expertise transcended formal training. "The reports and analyses are useful, but they're like studying sheet music to understand jazz. The real learning happens when you internalize the rhythms until they become part of you." Over the following weeks, she mentored Davis and her other assistants in this more holistic approach to aviation expertise. It was challenging work. These officers had been trained to quantify everything, to trust systems over instincts. Teaching them to value intuitive knowledge required fundamentally changing how they thought about expertise itself. The breakthrough came during a training exercise when Davis correctly identified engine problems based solely on subtle changes in aircraft behavior. "I felt it," he told Megan afterward, his voice filled with wonder. "Just like you described. The aircraft was trying to tell me something was wrong before any instruments registered the problem." "Now you're getting it," she replied. "That's not magic or some special talent. That's just what happens when you pay attention to information. That's always been there." The success of her training methods attracted attention from civilian aviation as well. Commercial airlines began sending their pilots to her courses, recognizing that the skills she taught could prevent accidents in severe weather conditions. Megan found herself consulting for aircraft manufacturers, helping them design systems that better communicated aircraft status to pilots. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. During a visit to a small airport in Montana, she encountered an elderly man working on a vintage crop duster. Something about his methodical approach to the aircraft inspection seemed familiar. "You know your way around these old birds," he commented, watching her examine the engine with obvious expertise. "My father taught me on one just like this," she replied. "Taught me that aircraft have personalities, that you have to listen to what they're telling you." The man smiled. "Your father sounds like he understood the old ways." Too many pilots these days trust their computers more than their instincts. As they talked, Megan realized that her journey had brought her full circle. The knowledge her father had passed down, the skills that had been dismissed as irrelevant in an age of advanced technology, had ultimately proven to be her greatest asset. She'd simply needed the right moment to demonstrate their value. 2 years after her dramatic rescue, Megan faced her greatest challenge yet. The Pentagon had approved her extreme weather operations school, and she was personally selected to lead the inaugural Class 30 of the military's most promising pilots. From across all branches of service, the pressure was immense. Unlike her informal training sessions at Elmendorf, this program would be scrutinized by senior leadership across the Department of Defense. Success would validate her methods and potentially save countless lives. Failure would end her career and discredit everything she'd worked to build. "No pressure at all," joked Major Reynolds, her newly assigned deputy, as they reviewed the roster of incoming students. "Just the future of military aviation weather training riding on the next 8 weeks." Megan smiled grimly. The students weren't typical junior officers. These were experienced pilots with impressive records, many of whom had initially resisted being assigned to a course taught by someone they saw as an unconventional instructor. Several had privately questioned whether a former mechanic could teach them anything they didn't already know. The first week was brutal. Captain Morgan, a decorated F-16 pilot, openly challenged methods during a simulator exercise. "With respect, Sergeant, I've been flying for 15 years. I don't need to feel what my aircraft is telling me. I have instruments that provide precise, quantifiable data." Rather than argue the point, Megan designed a special scenario. She programmed the simulator to replicate the exact conditions from her rescue flight, but with one crucial difference. The aircraft's instruments would show normal readings even as the engines began failing due to ice accumulation. "Your mission is simple," she told Morgan as he strapped into the simulator. "Get your crew home safely." For 20 minutes, Morgan flew by the book, trusting his instruments while the simulated aircraft gradually lost power. By the time warning lights finally appeared, it was too late. The aircraft crashed into the simulated Alaskan wilderness, killing everyone aboard. The classroom fell silent as the simulation ended. Morgan sat in the cockpit, staring at the instruments that had failed to warn him of the impending disaster. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. "The gauges showed everything was normal right up until the end," he said quietly. "How was I supposed to know the engines were failing?" "Megan, reset the simulation to the beginning. Let's try again. But this time, I want you to ignore what the instruments are telling you and focus on what the aircraft is telling you. Listen to the engine sounds through your headset. Feel the vibrations through the controls. Pay attention to how the aircraft responds to your inputs." This time, Morgan caught the problem within minutes. "Something's wrong with Engine 2, he announced, his voice carrying new uncertainty. "The instruments say it's fine, but it sounds ... off. Trust that instinct," Megan encouraged. "What do you want to do about it?" The exercise continued for another hour, with Morgan gradually learning to interpret subtle cues that his formal training had taught him to ignore. By the end, he'd successfully identified all 4 engine problems and managed to maintain flight despite the unreliable instrument readings. "That was unsettling," he admitted afterward. "Everything I've been taught says to trust the gauges, but they were completely wrong." "The gauges weren't wrong," Megan corrected. "They were measuring what they were designed to measure. But in extreme conditions, they don't always measure what you need to know. That's where experience and intuition become invaluable." The breakthrough with Morgan opened the floodgates. Other students began approaching Megan with newfound respect, eager to learn techniques that could supplement their formal training. The classroom atmosphere shifted from skepticism to intense focus as even the most experienced pilots recognized gaps in their knowledge. Lieutenant Commander Anderson, a Navy pilot with carrier qualifications, raised a concern during Week 3. "Sergeant Lawson, this is valuable training, but how do we know when to trust these instincts? In military aviation, Consistency and standardization save lives. What happens when individual interpretation conflicts with established procedures? It was the question Megan had been expecting, the fundamental tension between institutional protocol and individual expertise. Her answer would define how these pilots integrated her teachings with their existing training. "You never abandon procedures," she said firmly, "but you enhance them with additional information streams. Think of it as defensive flying. You use every available input to build the most complete picture possible. Procedures are your foundation, but awareness extends beyond what's written in the manual." She illustrated the point with a story from her crop dusting days. "My father once told me about a pilot who followed every regulation perfectly, but crashed because he ignored what his experience was telling him about wind conditions. The weather report said one thing, but the way dust moved across the field told a different story. The pilot who survived was the one who trusted his eyes over the forecast." The real test came during week 6, when the class faced their final scenario, a complex emergency that combined multiple system failures with severe weather conditions. Each student had to navigate the crisis using both formal procedures and the intuitive skills Megan had taught them. Captain Torres, an Air Force transport pilot, found herself facing the exact situation Megan had experienced 2 years earlier. As her simulated C-130 lost power in a blizzard, she demonstrated the integration of technical knowledge and experiential wisdom that defined Megan's teaching method. "Engine 2's running lean," Torres announced, her hands moving confidently over the controls. "I can hear the change in pitch, and the fuel flow pattern doesn't match what the gauges are showing." Switching to manual mixture control, she worked through the crisis methodically, using instrument readings to confirm what her enhanced awareness had already detected. When the simulation ended with a successful landing, the classroom erupted in applause, not just for Torres, but for the validation of everything they'd learned. General Patterson, the Air Force's Chief of Staff for Operations, attended the graduation ceremony personally. As he addressed the assembled students, his words carried the weight of institutional change. "What you've learned here represents the evolution of military aviation training," he said. "We've always emphasized technical proficiency and procedural adherence, and those remain crucial. But Sergeant Lawson has shown us that true expertise requires something more, the ability to integrate all available information, including inputs that aren't captured by instruments." During her own remarks, Megan reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, I was just a mechanic who happened to save a few lives," she said. "Today, I'm watching 30 of our finest pilots carry these lessons forward to protect countless others." The knowledge itself isn't new. Pilots have been using these techniques since the beginning of aviation. What's new is recognizing their value and teaching them systematically. After the ceremony, Captain Morgan approached her privately. His earlier skepticism had been completely replaced by genuine admiration. "Sergeant, I owe you more than just an apology. What you've taught us, it's going to save lives. I can feel it." "That's the point," Megan replied. "And now you'll teach others, and they'll teach others." Knowledge like this grows when it's shared. The success of the inaugural class exceeded everyone's expectations. Incident reports from across the military began showing improved outcomes in severe weather emergencies, with pilots citing techniques learned at Megan's school. Commercial airlines started sending their pilots for training, and foreign militaries requested access to the curriculum. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in the form of a simple email from a young pilot stationed in Afghanistan. "Sergeant Lawson," it read, "the skills you taught saved my crew last week when we lost hydraulics in a sandstorm. The instruments couldn't tell us what the aircraft was doing, but I could feel it through the controls. We made it home because you taught me to listen. Thank you." That email, more than any official commendation, validated everything Megan had worked to achieve. She'd taken knowledge that had been overlooked and dismissed, refined it through experience, and passed it on to the next generation. The invisible expert had become a visible teacher, but the core mission remained unchanged, keeping people alive when the sky turned dangerous. 5 years after that stormy night over Alaska, Megan stood in the Pentagon briefing room facing the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The room itself seemed designed to intimidate mahogany paneling, portraits of military legends, and an atmosphere heavy with the weight of decisions that shaped global security. Yet she felt calm, grounded by the knowledge that her work had already proven its worth countless times over. Sergeant Lawson, General Morrison, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, began. Your extreme weather operations program has exceeded every metric we established. Accident rates in severe weather have dropped by 47% across all services. Pilot confidence in challenging conditions has measurably improved. Most importantly, we estimate your training has directly saved over 300 lives. In the past 2 years alone, the briefing outlined plans to expand her program internationally, sharing the curriculum with allied nations whose pilots faced similar challenges. It represented the ultimate validation of techniques that had once been dismissed as irrelevant folk wisdom from a bygone era of aviation. What strikes me most, added Admiral Chun, Chief of Naval Operations, is how this all started with someone who wasn't even supposed to be flying. You fundamentally changed how we think about expertise and recognition within the military. After the meeting, Megan walked through Arlington National Cemetery, reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. The rows of white headstones stretched endlessly in every direction, representing thousands of service members who died in the line of duty. Many of those deaths had been preventable equipment failures, weather accidents, situations where knowledge and experience might have made the difference between tragedy and survival. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lieutenant Davis, now Captain Davis, who was running the Advanced Instructor Program at Peterson Air Force Base. Megan, it read, just graduated another class. These pilots are going to carry your teachings. The base is worldwide. The ripple effect continues. That ripple effect had become Megan's greatest source of satisfaction. Every pilot she'd trained was now teaching others, creating an exponential expansion of life-saving knowledge. The invisible expert had become a visible leader, but more importantly, she'd created a system that would outlive her own career. Her reflection was interrupted by a familiar voice. Sergeant Lawson? She turned to see Colonel Martinez, her former base commander from Elmendorf, now wearing the stars of a brigadier general. General Martinez, she said with genuine warmth. What brings you to Washington? Actually, you do, he replied with a smile. I'm here to discuss something that I think will interest you greatly. They walked together through the cemetery as Martinez explained his proposal. The Air Force is creating a new position director of experiential learning integration. It would be your job to identify overlooked expertise throughout the service and find ways to capture and share that knowledge before we lose it. The fees throughout the service and find ways to capture and share that knowledge before we lose it. Before we lose it. Position would be a significant promotion, but more importantly, it would allow Megan to address the broader issue her own story had highlighted. Throughout the military, there were undoubtedly countless individuals with valuable knowledge that remained unrecognized because it didn't fit traditional categories of expertise. Think about it, Martinez continued. How many mechanics know things about aircraft that pilots don't? How many supply sergeants understand logistics better than officers with advanced degrees? How many medics have field experience that could revolutionize medical training? Your job would be to find these people and give them a voice. It was an opportunity that perfectly aligned with everything Megan had learned about the nature of expertise itself. Real knowledge often existed in unexpected places, held by people who might never have the chance to demonstrate what they knew unless circumstances demanded it. That evening, she called her father for the first time in months, now in his 70s, and long retired from crop dusting. He still lived on the small farm where she'd learned to fly. "Dad," she said, "I wanted to thank you for something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "For teaching me that knowing how to do something matters more than having permission to do it. For showing me that expertise isn't about titles or certifications. It's about understanding how things really work." His voice carried the warmth of someone who'd watched his daughter exceed every dream he dared imagine for her. "You figured out how to take what I taught you and make it matter to the world. Negan, that's something I could never have done. But you gave me the foundation," she replied. "You taught me to listen to what aircraft were trying to tell me. Everything else just built on that." After the call, Megan sat on her apartment balcony overlooking the Potomac River, watching aircraft approach Reagan National Airport in the distance. Each landing represented a small victory, pilots using skills and knowledge to bring their passengers safely home. Some of those pilots had trained at her school, carrying forward techniques that might save their lives in the worst possible conditions. The next morning, she accepted General Martinez's offer. Her new position would take her across the entire military, seeking out hidden expertise and finding ways to integrate it into formal training programs. It was a mission that could take decades to complete, but it felt like the natural evolution of everything she'd worked toward. Her first assignment took her back to Elmendorf Air Force Base, where her journey had begun. The hangar looked exactly the same, filled with the familiar sounds of maintenance crews working on aircraft. But now, instead of being invisible among them, she was there to listen to identify mechanics, crew chiefs, and technicians whose knowledge could benefit the entire service. Airman Jackson, the young mechanic she'd mentored years earlier, was now a staff sergeant running his own maintenance crew. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with recognition and respect. "Sergeant Lawson, I heard you were coming back to visit. These young airmen don't believe me when I tell them I worked alongside the famous pilot instructor." "I'm not here as a pilot instructor," Megan replied with a smile. "I'm here to do what I should have been doing all along, listening to people like you who know these aircraft better than anyone." Over the next week, she interviewed dozens of maintenance personnel, discovering innovations and techniques that had never been formally documented. A crew chief had developed a method for detecting bearing failures weeks before traditional inspections would catch them. A young mechanic had found a way to improve fuel efficiency by adjusting engine timing in a manner not covered by technical manuals. Each discovery reinforced her belief that expertise existed everywhere, waiting to be recognized and shared. The invisible experts weren't really invisible. They'd simply been overlooked by systems that value credentials over knowledge, rank over experience. On her final day at Elmendorf, Megan stood in the same spot where she'd first felt those engine irregularities that had saved everyone's lives. The memory was vivid, the fear, the determination, the moment when she'd stopped being invisible and started being essential. Snow was falling again, thick flakes that reminded her of that night when everything had changed. But now she understood that the change hadn't really begun in the cockpit during the emergency. It had started years earlier, with every hour she'd spent learning to listen to aircraft, every moment her father had taught her to value knowledge over permission. As she prepared to leave Alaska behind once more, Megan realized that her story had become something larger than personal success. It was proof that expertise could emerge from anywhere, that the people doing the work often understood it better than those managing it, and that true knowledge couldn't remain hidden forever. The invisible expert had become visible not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of demonstrating competence when it mattered most. And now, her mission was to ensure that other invisible experts would have the chance to be seen, heard, and valued before an emergency forced their recognition. Snow continued to fall over Alaska, and danger could still strike at any moment without warning or mercy. But true skill and hard-earned experience never remained. Hidden forever, they had a way of surfacing exactly when they were needed most. The legacy of that stormy night would continue through every pilot who learned to trust their instincts, every maintenance worker whose knowledge was formally recognized, and every military member who understood that the person in the background might actually be the one who could save everyone when everything fell apart. In a world obsessed with credentials and hierarchy, Megan Lawson had proven that competence speaks louder than any title ever could. She didn't need permission to save lives. She just needed the moment when everything mattered most. And when that moment came, she was ready. The invisible experts were invisible no more. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.